Welcome back to another episode of the Four Archetypes. Today, as always, we return to Mary Louise von Franz's Archetypal Symbols and Fairy Tales. And today's fairy tale, Nursing a Fairy. It's about the ghostly love of the animus. Okay, before we get into this, let's introduce everybody, see if everybody wants to say hello. Whit, how you doing today? Welcome back.
Hello, good morning. Thank you.
Dr. Lisa.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Dr. Eric.
Good eye, mates.
Okay. All right. Well, that's what you get. All right. So why don't we head off into the land of fairy tales? Dr. Eric, take it away.
English tale, Nursing a Fairy. A thrifty housewife lived on one of the hills between Zenor Churchtown and St. Ives. One night a gentleman came to her cottage and told her he had marked her cleanliness and her care, that he had a child whom he desired to have brought up with much tenderness, and he had fixed on her. She would be very handsomely rewarded for her trouble, and he showed her a considerable quantity of golden coin. Well, she agreed, and away she went with the gentleman to fetch this child. When they came to the side of Zenor Hill, the gentleman told the woman he must blindfold her, and she, good easy soul, having heard of such things, fancied this was some rich man's child, and that the residence of its mother was not to be known. So she gave herself great credit for cunning and quietly submitting. They walked on some considerable distance. When they stopped, the handkerchief was taken from her eyes, and she found herself in a magnificent room, with a table spread with the most expensive luxuries in the way of game, fruits, and wines. She was told to eat, and she did so with some awkwardness and not a little trembling. She was surprised that so large a feast should have been spread for so small a party, only herself and the master. At last, having enjoyed luxuries such as she never tasted before or since, a silver bell was rung, and a troop of servants came in, bearing a cot covered with satin, in which was sleeping the most beautiful babe that human eyes ever gazed on. She was told this child was to be committed to her charge. She should not want for anything, but she was to obey certain laws. She was not to teach the child the Lord's Prayer. She was not to wash it after sundown. She was to bathe it every morning in water, which she would find in a white ewer placed in the child's room. This was not to be touched by anyone but herself, and she was to be careful not to wash her own face in this water. In all other respects, she was to treat the child as one of her own children. The woman was blinded again, and the child having been placed in her arms, away she trudged, guided by the mysterious father. When on the road, the bandage was removed from her eyes, and she found she had a small baby in her arms, not remarkably good looking, with very sharp, piercing eyes, and ordinarily dressed. However, a bargain is a bargain, so she resolved to make the best of it. And she presented the babe to her husband, telling him so much of the story as she thought it prudent to trust him with. For years, the child was with this couple. They never wanted for anything. Meat and even wines were provided, as most people thought, by wishing for them. Clothes ready-made were on the child's bed when required, and the charmed water was always in the magic ewer. The little boy grew active and strong. He was remarkably wild, yet very tractable, and he appeared to have a real regard for his quote-unquote big mammy, as he called the woman. Sometimes she thought the child was mad. He would run and leap and scream as though he were playing with scores of boys when no soul was near him. The woman had never seen the father since the child had been with them, but ever and anon money was conveyed to them in some mysterious manner.
One morning, when washing the boy, this good woman, who had often observed how bright the water made the face of the child, was tempted to try it if it would improve her own beauty. So, directing the boy's attention to some birds singing on a tree outside the window, she splashed some of the water up into her face. Most of it went into her eye. She closed it instinctively, and upon opening it, she saw a number of little people gathered around her and playing with the boy. She said not a word, though her fear was great, and she continued to see the world of small people surrounding the world of ordinary men and women, being with them, but not of them. She now knew who the boy's playmates were, and she often wished to speak to the beautiful creatures of the invisible world who were his real companions. But she was discreet and kept silence. Curious robberies had been from time to time committed in St. Ives Market, and although the most careful watch had been kept, the things disappeared and no thief detected. One day our good housewife was at the market, and to her surprise she saw the father of her nursling. Without ceremony she ran up to him, at a moment when he was putting some choice fruit by stealth into his pocket, and spoke to him. "So thou seest me, dost thou?" "To be sure I do, and know it too," replied the woman. "Shut this eye," putting his finger on her left eye. "Can't see me now?" "Yes, I tell 'ee, and I know and know 'ee too." Again said the woman, "Water for elf, not water for self." "You've lost your eye, your child and yourself," said the gentleman. From that hour she was blind in the right eye. When she got home, the boy was gone. She grieved sadly and never saw him again. This once happy couple became poor and wretched.
Okay.
The end.
Very interesting. So, in terms of archetypes, in terms of archetypal structures, we know this is a magical child. We know that the sorcerer or magician who brings the child gives instructions for the care of the child. We know that the woman is the archetype of the lover, and he uses that to sway her to care for the child. But she's also, there's an emptiness about her that she needs something to fill. So this mystical child has a place in her life where she knows there's something wrong with the whole story, because she has to convince herself at the beginning of the story to believe what this magician sorcerer story about, that this is a rich man's child and the child is without a mother and needs to be cared for. But then he gives her strict instructions. Before we get into the strict instructions, what are your thoughts? Anybody? What are your thoughts about her? What do you see in her? What do you see that's missing that she needs to compensate for? So clearly something is missing in her life and she needs to compensate for it. Besides the money. Yeah, Dr.
I think you were right on. It wasn't, I don't think it's as much about the money as it is her just being empty. And I think, I mean, hate to be sound predictable, but she's missing love.
Yeah.
and connection. And but I think somewhat she lives in an idealistic world about it, because at first it was the most beautiful baby ever seen. Then the next time she saw it, it was really nothing to look at. And it said, basically, she said, well, a deal's a deal. So it was almost as if this isn't going to be as perfect as I wanted. So I think those two elements juxtapose. I've seen that play out in people where they want this, they're missing something, they want this beautiful, perfect, idyllic thing, and when it's not so idyllic, they question it.
Like
You
having
would-
a child to make you feel better,
Yeah,
or getting a pet because you're lonely.
yes.
And then once you're not lonely, you don't want the pet.
Or marrying the Prince Charming or the beautiful princess, and then you find out that no one lives up to that.
Yeah. In her case, she thought, well, some wealth and a child to care for might be something that will give me happiness. And according to the tale, but she is unsure of what type of happiness she's getting, because she lies to the husband, right? She tells him only the parts of the story that she thinks he will accept. She doesn't tell him about the rest of the story. She doesn't tell him about the blindfold. She doesn't tell him about where he takes her. So our heroine is lonely and wants to be loved. The relationship with the husband seems secondary. It doesn't seem like there's a real relationship there. The relationship with the child seems primary. The magical child.
Mhm.
The child on page 101 says, so she resolved to make the best of it. She presented the babe to her husband, telling him so much of the story as she thought it prudent to trust him with. For years, the child was with this couple. They never wanted for anything. By wishing for them, clothes ready-made were on the child's bed when required, so it's a magical child. Everything comes with the child. And then she says, the charmed water was always in the magic. Aware. So the magic, the magic of the water, the magic of the cleanse, right? The magic of the purification in the water, the magical water. Right? So water can be holy, it can be sacred, it can be magical, it could be everlasting. The drops of the gods. The little boy grew active and strong. He's remarkably wild, yet very tractable, and he appeared to have a real regard for his big mammy, as he called the woman. Sometimes she thought the child was mad. He would run and leap and scream as though he were playing with scores of boys with no souls. No soul was near him. So no soul was near her. Right? This is why it's a magical child. This is why he exists in her imagination. This is why this is the animus, right? And what happens with the animus? The one had never seen the father since the child had been with them. So since she had the dream. But ever and anon, money was conveyed to them in some mysterious manner. So money appeared magically. One morning when washing the boy, this good woman who had often observed how bright the water made the face of the child, So suddenly she's become jealous of the child. This is when the relationship goes bad. She becomes jealous of her own vision. And she once more, who had often observed how bright the water made the face of the child, was tempted to try if it would improve her own beauty. Okay, now I want to be young. I don't want to be the magical mother. I want to be the magical maiden. I want to transform.
This is where I have a question.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, but yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I was just curious as to why did she have to disobey one of the main rules in order for her to become able to see what was really there?
Well, without questioning, we cannot move further. We don't learn anything without questioning. We have to question. This is how we grow. This is how we develop. This is how we change. The 5-year-old doesn't ask the same questions as a 7-year-old. 7-year-old asks different questions. The 5-year-old asks different questions from the 3-year-old. This is all about consciousness. This is all about the expansion of consciousness, right? We start to ask different questions. Always there is a question to ask. Always there is more consciousness to be had. Once I realize what I am hallucinating, what my delusion is, where I live, where my imagination has taken me, something changes.
That all makes good sense. I think it prompts a secondary question about it, and that is many of the stories that we've seen like this, where people disobeyed what the rules were, similar stories to this, where they disobeyed the rules, they were immediately punished for it. She was punished. She was too, but before she was punished, she was enlightened. The others weren't enlightened in the same. The others weren't given a gift the way she was, and I wonder what makes this story different.
Yeah, I think in highlighting the timeline of the story, and like if you just make it into an Aesop's tale, this is a hard case. This is a case of someone having the grass is greener. She came in with the feeling of the grass is greener, and the story ended with the grass is greener. And her desires of the grass is greener got her. There was an opportunity, but she kept that feeling still persisted. It wasn't resolved. And it led to her feeling of tragedy and loss in all the aspects of possibility of youth, in the fulfillment of being the mother. And she came into the story unhappy, and she's left the story unhappy.
I like that parallel. Thank you.
There's one, there's a strange evolution though. And that is, 341. At last, having enjoyed luxuries such as she never tasted before or since, a silver bell was rung, and a troop of servants came in, bearing a cot covered with satin, in which was sleeping the most beautiful babe that human eyes ever gazed on. Fast forward. She's on her way she's on her return. The woman was blind. Let's see here. When out on the road, the bandage was removed from her eyes, and she found she had a small baby in her arms, not remarkably good looking, with very sharp, piercing eyes, and ordinarily dressed. However, a bargain is a bargain. So she resolved to make the best of it, and she presented the babe to her husband, telling him so much of the story as she thought it prudent to trust him with. And then we get, to these moments where she thought, taking into consideration the time, the context of mad, he's running
Ooh.
around wild. He's very physically able. I don't know if that's necessarily a negative connotation, but there's
Well, it seems like her
there's
vision
a
is getting
strange
more
progression
aggressive.
there.
Her vision is getting more aggressive. Her vision is becoming more out of control, as she puts it. Well, she says he would run and leap and scream as though we were playing with scores of
Well,
boys.
let's go before then, though.
Sure.
Let's not focus on that, but let's focus on the fact that at first it was the most beautiful baby, and
Babies
then
change.
Say that
um,
again.
Babies are beautiful. Babies become dirty and clingy and needy and crying, and they have to be taken care of, and consciousness changes of the object that I am connected to. My consciousness of the object changes. My relationship of it with that person, with that thing changes. My ability to understand and tolerate changes.
mhm.
That's
But
consciousness. That's
possibly,
how consciousness grows. That's how consciousness change. Even in her case, her consciousness, she is limited in her consciousness because in the beginning, her eyes are blindfolded, right? She has a blindfold on.
but
She doesn't see.
not the entire time.
No, but the beginning of the story starts out where she was blind. The symbol of her being blindfolded and taken somewhere to have something. So she was already blind.
But there's extravagance and so forth.
And then the extravagance was, once I was blind, now I can see. Suddenly I can see all this. Okay. So
But
consciousness,
with that honeymoon sparkle, with that freshness, newness, idyllic, dreamy fulfillment.
yeah, the fantasy.
The
The
fantasy.
fantasy is great.
The most beautiful child.
Exactly. You buy the best looking crib, you
So-
buy the best looking plush toys, you buy the cutest little clothes. Then the child, who's human, throws up all over the beautiful clothes and takes a crap on that beautiful bed. And now you have to deal with the child as is. This is coming to consciousness of something that is changing and something that is not always pretty.
Okay, so
Well,
yeah.
I don't know if it's a coming to consciousness of it. I think it is her attitude of lacking appreciation of what it was gifted to her.
Yeah.
So now her dazzling, beautiful newborn babe is now just a plain average infant.
I mean, if
Right?
we're, yeah,
This lack of
exactly.
appreciation.
I think
That's
if
a
we're
really
going to
good
be
point,
kind of,
Lisa.
yeah, I think if we're going to be kind of technical, it's not very long after she starts to see a different child.
Correct.
Mhm.
Yeah, she starts to have problems with the child.
That's part of my point. She's just been unblindfolded,
Yeah.
and the baby's in her arms to return, and it's already, it's no longer the most magnificent, or, I mean, that's kind of
Yeah,
so
I mean, she didn't have a miserable life before the child arrives. So usually these stories tell you if she had a miserable existence, if she was poor, if she lived in the woods, if she didn't have a home, if she couldn't bear any children. What we see is that she had a stable life, but not a very happy one. She's searching for happiness, and so the happiness comes in terms of monetary cash, and comes in the form of the ghostly lover, the child that doesn't exist.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure
and
she was
now-
searching for it because she was very dutiful and practical. It doesn't mean she was creative and seeking and trying and taking risks. She was just executing habits of cleanliness, right? So it's like she's just doing the dutiful thing, but waiting for something to happen like magic. not necessarily creating
Yeah.
opportunities for it.
Yeah, and
And
now
that
she's
that was her resignation with the child. She was dutifully doing the execution of the steps.
yeah.
So at the beginning of the story, Lisa, one night a gentleman came to her cottage and told her he had marked her cleanliness and her care, and that a child whom he desired to have brought up with much tenderness, and he fixed on her. He had fixed on her. She should be very handsomely rewarded for her trouble. She showed her considerable quantity of gold coin. Well, she agreed, and away she went with the gentleman to fetch this child. When they came to the side of Zin or Hell, the gentleman told the woman he must blindfold her. So she was already blindfolded. She was already blind. She could not see. Her life at the beginning was what? Clean, manicured,
Thrifty.
perfect.
Mhm.
But unhappy and empty.
Unhappy and
Unfulfilled. Yeah.
and
Unfulfilled,
blind.
even better, Lisa.
Mhm.
And I
And
think, and when did she start changing? She started changing when she left the wonderful environment, when she left the servants, when she left the idyllic place and started going back home to her husband, to the
Mhm.
empty life that she had been living her whole life.
yeah, so it starts to unravel. The bandage
Yeah.
was removed from her eyes. The bandage is a bandage. Bandage means she was blind. Something was wrong with her eyes. There's a bandage on them. So the bandage was removed from her eyes, and she found she had a small baby in her arms. So suddenly, something is removed from the way we view things, and something miraculous appears. And that's usually the golden child, right? This is an old myth. The golden child brings with them their fortune. Each child brings their own fortune. So when you think of having a child, you don't think of, I don't have anything, because the myth goes that each child brings their fortune with them. And therefore, that's why you have the child. The child is basically already exists in the psyche before it needs to be born. It is already born. You already believe there's a child out there. You know, people start talking about having kids way before they have kids. It's like, yeah, I want a kid, I want a boy, I want a girl. Suddenly that child starts to exist. It starts to exist in story. It starts to exist it starts to take up space in my mind. It starts to take up space in my home. I start to see where the child would sleep, where the child would play. I don't know what you just adopted a puppy, right? Tell us about that, of having a
Oh,
puppy. What
yeah.
has changed about you, the way you live, the way you, and how has that changed you, having this creature around all the time?
I don't know.
Does he occupy
Well,
space in your mind?
you have to be more thoughtful about you know, there's more needs, so
Needs that are not yours.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was not a like a super quick decision or something. So there was some
No, but they
there was
start
some
to take up
preparation
space.
for that. But I
Yeah.
think the preparation, like to your point, is you are starting to plan out, okay, this is an area that works for the dog. This is an area that doesn't work for the dog, or this part of the where we live needs to be, more secured for the dog, and this part, so you're imagining what life looks like, with the dog. I think it's a little bit like, yeah, it's good parallels.
Yeah, it's a creation, right? It's a creation story because you basically have to create space. You have to create psychological space. You have to create emotional space because no longer are you caring for yourself and your partner. Now you're caring for another being. In this case, the dog. So now you have to think of the dog. It's like, oh, we're going out to dinner. What about the dog? Oh, we've had breakfast. What about the dog? Oh, did you have
Right.
lunch? Yeah. What about the dog? So suddenly now the dog exists. They exist. They occupy space in the house. They occupy space in our conversation. They occupy space in our plans. They occupy space in, oh, where are we going to leave the dog? Who's going to care for the dog? Oh, I'd love to take that trip. What about the dog? Go ahead, Lisa. Lisa knows about the dog.
Oh, no, I said, I'll take care of it. If you're going
Oh,
Yeah, that's what
Lisa's
I was.
volunteering to take
That's
care
what
of
I
the
was.
dog.
That's how I was. Interpreting that, and that's what I was hoping for too.
Well, so you guys were on the same tune, yeah. Okay.
But this,
So
I
the
think
creation,
this is
of the child, the creation of the child is always a magical golden child, a ghost that is created way before the real child takes place. Now, what happens when a child that was already created in my mind with my partner
but that's
doesn't exist?
that may be the lesson, or that
Yeah.
may be
Go on.
the what do they say? The moral of the story.
Mm.
Expectations. That I think now in kind of modern, actually, I don't think it's modern at all, actually. I think that the idea of thinking about things less before they happen has benefit. We talk about that sometimes.
Mm.
Don't think too much about it before. It applies to lots of different things. I think.
You're talking about ruminating, right?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, getting
Overthinking,
stuck
ruminating.
in like the
No,
creation process.
right.
Like I'm not gonna create it. I'm just gonna like get bogged down by it. It's too big of
was
an idea, crushes
right.
me.
And we say things now like going with the flow and crossing the bridge when when we
When
come
you
to
come to it, does she go with the flow? Is the question. Does
she
our
strikes me as
heroine?
she strikes me as, yeah, I don't know, is she a heroine?
Well, it's her story.
Yeah.
Whether whether she turns out to it's her story. Therefore, she is the heroine of her story. That's
I
hers.
feel that she
Tries to change the flow.
it's a sad story.
It is a sad story.
Well, yeah, she wakes up to the reality of her loss.
Yeah.
The
And
loss
we
is
also have no idea about the child too.
well, the child is a part of her. It's part of her imagination. It's a
Okay.
creation of hers. The animus gives her the child. The animus,
Okay.
the internal masculine, and her, as they have the conversation, a child is born, her child. She doesn't tell the husband
Oh, excuse me.
about how the child came about.
He
There's a
was gone.
reason for that.
Right.
Yeah.
He was gone. She grieved, never saw him again.
Yeah, and he was gone, which means that the child that the fantasy of the child that she had, the fantasy that never came true. Remember, at the end of the story, she's blind in one eye. That means she had lost the child. This is the ghost of the child she would have had.
Yeah.
This is the ghost of the voices she would have seen and heard. Little kids running after each other, screaming, yelling, playing. That's the sound of little kids playing. What did she say? She says, sometimes she thought the child was mad. He would run and leap and scream as though he were playing with scores of boys. Well, at times
That's normal.
She
Yeah.
She was mad
Yeah.
because that's what she was seeing and hearing.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. So this is about her loss. This is about the way that she has been devastated, right? She takes off the bandages, but in the end, we realize that she's still blind in one eye.
Mm-hmm.
She's still blind to the loss. The loss had blinded her.
Yeah, the child isn't loving her as much as she was hoping and fantasizing that it would.
Yeah. She runs out to try to find the child's father. Okay, well, where do you find the father if it's an animus, if it's the internal masculine? Well, you start to search for people who you could project on the animus. How do people have relationships? Well, we project onto them what we need from them internally. What we need internally, we project it out on them. They hold the projection and we say, yeah, so this is why I love this person. This is exactly why I love them. Well, that's our projection of our internal need. They somehow take the role of fulfilling that need in our projection. And then we fall in love. What are we falling in love with? A solution to our own emptiness, loneliness, problem, connection, attachment, disconnection. We find that connection, and suddenly the outside connection. Now, what happens is that the other projects back onto us. That's why the mother-child bond, not just the biological bond, but the psychological bond is so strong. The child is a growth. It's a development from within me. It's a creation. It's a creation of a new soul. It's a creation of a new thing in the world. Right?
She still used the water though.
The water is interesting, right? The water is a symbol.
Water for elf,
Yeah.
not water for self. So she
Water for elf, not water for self, which means that I didn't use the water for me. That's what blinded her.
Yeah.
What blinded her was she wanted to be the child. She wanted to be young again. She wanted to be a maiden. She wanted to be fertile again. But she was already blind. The story, if you think about the story as a time walk, but you have to walk it backwards. The end of the story is the beginning of the story, and the beginning of the story is the end of the story. A woman lived with her husband in an unhappy, unfulfilled relationship due to the loss of the child that was never born.
The circle of life.
That's a wrap.
So, fascinating story, though.
Yeah,
Fascinating story. Very sad story.
it is sad. I'm sad now.
Mm.
So my question would be to everybody listening and to us,
Happy Wednesday.
how could the fairy tale been different, and how could the ending have changed to be a happier fairy tale, or what could have been different in the fairy tale to make it a happier fairy tale? We all have choices, and there are places for us to find fulfillment within ourselves.
Well, one of the choices is that loss doesn't define who we are and what we are. That's one of the choices. That's a difficult choice because loss is so
Personal,
destructive and personal. Yes,
intimate.
it's so harsh, you know, especially if we're not reading the story literally but metaphorically, symbolically, which we do. The loss of the child is devastating. So to create a fantasy world of the child growing, finding the child in your arms. In this story, she says she found the child. The woman was blinded again, the child having been placed in her. The child was placed in her arms. This is a birth. What happens after birth? The child's placed in the mother's arms to breastfeed. That's what happens after birth. When out on the road, the bandages was removed from her eyes. She found she had a small baby in her arms, not remarkably good looking. Very well. How do little babies come out? They're covered in slime. They're screaming and yelling. They look like a little alien that just crawled out of you, right? So yeah, they're not remarkably beautiful. They're just babies. There's an organism that's just been born. But that's what she lost. She lost that. She lost the organism.
Yeah.
It wasn't like she's saying, she's pleading. It's almost like pleading. It wasn't that pretty. It wasn't, you know, in the Emirates, because they lose so many children, they name their children after things that people think are less important, or like dog. Like they'll call them dog because that way that the people don't see that they're having children, and the evil eye kills the child off. So they would give them these names to say, well, you know, they're not that important. You could leave them alone. They're named after a dog. They're named after like they're named after a crazy thing. They're named after something that doesn't mean much, right? And that's all part of the mystical idea of preserving the creation. This is all about preserving the creation. And having, what is creation? Creation in itself. What is creation? Creation is a way that we become immortal. What is having a child? It's immortality. I can die, but my child is still on the earth. My father says this to me all the time. He's like, I need an heir. I need a son.
Hello, Moto.
He doesn't want to die.
Mhm.
Dr. Eric, of course, has his own, like,
Can you mute him? There
oh
we go.
yeah, I
He's
did.
got a phone going off.
Yeah.
Well, what do we think? Lisa had a question there for the audience.
Yeah.
How could the fairy tale end differently? Right? So that
Yeah, I guess that's where I started, but I guess what I mean is, what are the lessons that the practical housewife could have learned so that her story wasn't so tragic in this fairy tale?
in this fairy tale, yeah.
Then I'll just leave it up to the audience to think about. It is a tragic story.
Well, yeah, I mean, tragedy is always it's the essence of existence. And in her existence, tragedy is what is what holds her.
Yeah, and in this storyline, as we all mentioned, it's cyclical. These patterns are cyclical for her. She's learning. The story goes around again.
Yeah.
How can she get her? What could this lady do to get her out of that? Kick her out of this circle?
Absolutely. Okay. If you're interested in something similar to this, there's a movie on, I'm trying to remember the name, but it's on Netflix. It's a new movie, and it's about falling in love with jinn, a magical creature that gives you 3 wishes. So check that out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of the Four Archetypes. As we always bid you farewell in our affirmation, I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
Dr. Eric?
I'm not afraid.
I am not afraid.
We are not afraid. We are the Four Archetypes, and we will see you next week with another fairy tale.